This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is brought to you by False Idols, a high-stakes thriller for fans of White Collar and Homeland. False Idols is a production of Serial Box, which brings you serialized fiction from teams of today's best writers. To get a discount on the first season of any Serial Box series, visit serialbox.com and use the promo code GEEK18.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 293 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Bill McKibben. He's the founder of 350.org, an environmental group that advocates for urgent action on climate change, and he's also written over a dozen books on environmentalism and related subjects. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new book, Radio Free Vermont, a humorous novel about a radio host who sparks a movement for Vermont to secede from the U.S., and about his 2003 book, Enough, in which he argues that nanotechnology, advanced robotics, and genetic engineering of humans present unacceptable dangers and should be halted. And today's show is brought to you by False Idols, about an FBI agent who goes deep undercover in Cairo's glittering art world. False Idols is a production of Serial Box, a new company that brings you serialized fiction from teams of today's best writers. The team behind False Idols includes Patrick Luhier, author of Radiant Night, Diana Wren, author of Tokyo Heist, Lisa Klink, who is a writer on Star Trek Voyager, and Robert Whitman, who is the founder of the FBI's Art Crime Division. And here's a description of the book. It says, FBI linguist Layla El-Deeb is deep undercover, posing as an heiress in the Middle East. She must infiltrate the highest echelons of society in order to trace priceless relics from their millionaire owners back to illegal digs and the terrorist groups profiting from their sale. But Layla's troubled past and growing feelings for an art dealer's son begin to complicate her judgment, and when she uncovers a terrorist plot that threatens American and Egyptian lives, she must decide where her loyalties truly lie. Based on true events, False Idols is a tense, sexy international thriller. So if that sounds like your sort of thing, you can join the plot with Serial Box right now. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listeners can get a discount on the first season of any Serial Box series by going to serialbox.com and entering the promo code GEEK18. So that's SERIALBOX.com, and the code is GEEK18. The first episode of False Idols, titled Operation Cairo, is also available as a free ebook over at Amazon.com. Alright, so now let's get to our interview. Alright, so we're here with Bill McKibben. Welcome to the show.
Hey, it's a real pleasure to be with you all.
Okay, so your new book is called Radio Free Vermont. So how'd that come about?
Well, this is a departure for me. It's the first fiction that I've ever written on purpose anyway. And it came about largely because I was on the road all the time organizing the climate movement. We started 350.org a decade ago, and because there was no climate movement, sort of getting it off the ground, I was kind of the moving part and was on the road for much of the last decade, often spending more nights on the road than at home in the course of the year. And I was very, very homesick, not only for my wife and family, but for the place that I loved in Vermont. And so writing this was kind of a pastime to cope with a little bit of that homesickness. And I didn't actually really expect that I was going to publish it. But then when Mr. Trump was elected, it seemed like the last thing the world probably needed was another one of my usual fairly dire nonfiction books about the trouble we're in. I mean, I wrote the first book about climate change 30 years ago, and I haven't really stopped since. I didn't seem like that was what we needed last year. It seemed like actually if I was ever going to publish something funny, that would be the year when it might be useful to do it. And so it's a love letter to Vermont and also a kind of love letter, a mash note to the resistance that I've been a part of for a decade or so, and it's really sprung up beautifully over the last year in response to the predations of our president.
Well, right. I heard you say that you've been thinking about the idea for 8 or 9 years or so, which means that you were kind of thinking about Vermont secession well before Trump came along.
Yeah, I mean, as I say in the book, Vermont secession is more of a plot device than a real goal. Although, you know, if there's a second Trump administration, ask me then. I think at the moment probably doesn't make a great deal of sense for Vermont to go secede. I think we're better off trying to build sort of big movements to stand up to him. But the virtue, it was a good way to talk about things that matter to me, the virtues of localness and smallness and neighborliness and resistance and civility. And all these things seem crucial to me.
I mean, do you think there's a sense, though, in which maybe the nation state is kind of outliving its usefulness and we are going to see smaller and smaller political entities coming to the fore in the future? You talk about one of the characters in the book muses, why not city states again?
Yeah, I think that probably I think in general the world is headed in a decentralized direction. I mean, think about it. When I was young, we had 3 television channels. That's where broadcast information came from, and you just sort of sat and absorbed it, and it came from some 3 centralized rooms someplace in New York. And now, of course, for better and for worse, information is absolutely everywhere, coming from every direction. We're all both producers and consumers of it. It's a radically decentralized world. I think the same thing, we hope, will happen with energy. Instead of a few big coal-fired power plants, 10 million solar panels on 10 million roofs all interconnected into a working grid. It wouldn't surprise me at all to see the same thing happen with political power. And, the United States may be a real candidate for some of that. 300 and some million people seems to be reaching the limits of what you can successfully coordinate. I mean, any system that throws up Donald Trump as a plausible answer to the question, who should lead us, is probably not working at peak efficiency. I don't think it's going to be Vermont, probably, that disappears from the Union first. We're an old state. All you'd have to do is threaten to cut off Social Security, and I think we'd capitulate. But I increasingly wonder whether California is in it for the long haul or not. California, and with it Washington and Oregon. I mean, California is the 5th largest economy in the world, taken on its own. It's Germany. And it dominates the fields that the world, most prizes right now, technology, and I have no idea what benefit it really gets from being part of the United States at this point. It seems to me entirely plausible that you could think up events that would cause the good people of the Golden State to say, maybe we could go this alone.
Well, right. And I mean, you've pointed out that California has so many more people than, Montana, say, but has the same 2 senators. And I wonder, even if California wasn't in secession for the long run, if they might threaten secession at some point as a means of leverage to try to redress that injustice.
It could well be, and I don't know whether our system is nimble enough to cope with that. I don't know whether Montana, or for that matter Vermont, is willing to let go of any of its outsized power. We set up this system to be to be a system of great checks on power of all kinds. But there's so many checks on government power now that our government doesn't do very much. And as a result, a motley collection of rich people have kind of taken over many of our affairs. And at a certain point, people just aren't going to put up with it any longer. And it's hard to see exactly what form that will take. I hope, and this was the vision I was trying to kind of lay out in the book a little bit, that it takes a kind of gentle, good-humored, and nonviolent form.
Right. Well, I mean, it's actually, speaking of violence,
and one with a lot of beer also.
Well, speaking of violence, though, I mean, sort of the precedent we have for secession is the Civil War, which,
Yes.
established the idea that there would be if a state tries to secede, there will be a war. And back then you could, a group of states could fight a group of other states and have some
Yes.
sort of rough parity in their military force,
Right.
which is unimaginable today. I mean, if the U.S. military is on one side, there
Right.
is no other side,
Right. Right. That wouldn't work like that. On the other hand, since the Civil War, we've invented the idea of nonviolence as a kind of resistance means, and found that it's actually extraordinarily effective. That is to say, it's true that the U.S. military could drop an atom bomb on San Francisco if it wanted to, but it's also true that the people of San Francisco could figure out how, not to comply with the demands of someone that they keep doing what they're doing, and that would cause real problems. So things are not as, power has its limits, military power anyway, and that's one of the most interesting things, I think, about the 21st century. If you wanted to list the most important technological innovations of the 20th century, I think most people would start in on nuclear power and genetic sequencing and computers and things, but I think it's possible that nonviolence was one of the more interesting technologies that the 20th century developed, and I think the solar panel was another of the most interesting, and it tends to lead us in some of the same directions towards a kind of smallness and localness and whatever.
Well, and I tend to agree with you that just the ground has shifted when it comes to secession. I mean, I would imagine that if California seceded or Texas did or something, I don't imagine a war. It seems like we're past that point.
It seems like unclear what the war would be about exactly. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a major plot point of this book is that the secession movement is spearheaded by a radio host. And
yes.
Obviously, as a podcaster, I kind of liked that. Could you talk about kind of why you thought a radio host would be the main character?
Well, partly, of course, this book is a collection of my particular own joys and vices in the world. It's no accident that it features the only cross-country ski chase scene in American literature, because that's my particular passion. But radio is another. I've always been impressed with the power of the world of podcasting and things. Doesn't surprise me that radio and the spoken word has managed to survive, indeed thrive, even with all the competition that's come, because it's a superior technology. If you think about video, it's hopelessly limited by the fact that you can only do things that you can take a picture of, which is a small subset of things and not the most interesting. Radio allows an extraordinary play of ideas in your head, and you can listen to it while you're cooking, or driving, or doing lots of other things. And so it's extraordinarily powerful, and it's the way that, because of the low technological barriers to entry, because it's relatively cheap and things, it's been the way that communities for a century have communicated with each other. Now, we've lost a lot of that localness of radio as things have homogenized and corporatized, but there are still stations, at least in Vermont, that remind us of its power, and indeed it's one of those that served as the rough model for much of the stuff in this book. I really like the idea that this septuagenarian hero of this thing had spent his life just talking to people on the radio day after day after day, taking the pulse of his community. It's what finally got him to the breaking point.
So what is that radio station in Vermont that you think that this is modeled on?
It's a radio station called WDEV that I wrote a long piece about for Harper's maybe 10 years ago, 15. It's been in the same family as the guy who founded it in the 1930s. And it, has a couple of hours of local call-in radio in the morning, but it also carries the Red Sox game. It also carries the local stock car races. It also has its own bluegrass band that plays on Saturday morning. It also carries, back-to-back girls' high school basketball games 2 or 3 nights a week, so on and so forth. It's an actual, and everybody listens to it. It's got by far the highest ratings. It's a reminder of what actual communication at a local level did look like and could look like again.
And it has political sway. Would you say that it could actually move the needle on, maybe a secession is a bit whimsical, but those sorts of political issues?
Sure. Sure. It's one of the most important outlets in this small state. Candidates for governor line up to talk to it. Election season rolls around. And partly that's the vacuum that's been created by the absence of other media. We really barely have a daily newspaper, left in Burlington, the one city in the state of Vermont. There's not that much left, and so the things that are stand out all the more starker. We have an immense amount of media. You obviously can spend all day marinating in podcasts and, news feeds and RSS bulletins and things, but the amount of local media and coverage and things is infinitely smaller than it was a generation ago. A generation ago, there wasn't a school board meeting in America without a reporter present at it, and that is no longer even close to the case.
Now, is that a liberal station, or is it more centrist? Because it's sort of a truism that right-wing talk kind of dominates talk radio.
Some of each. They have a kind of right-wing guy on in the morning for an hour, but it's also the only commercial radio station in America that carries Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! In the evening. So it's got some of everything. Another reason I like it, one of the points of this book is that ideology doesn't need to be the main, or at least party identification, the main sort of tribal marker that we have. Vermont is an interesting state because, and this is one of the plot devices in the book, it governs itself by town meeting. Each town gets together on the first Tuesday in March, and everybody comes together in a kind of Athenian democracy. You sit around in the church basement or the high school auditorium all day and decide on the budget for the year, and everybody has a vote, and that's how it goes. And one of the results of that is that, at least at that level, it's not a particularly partisan place at all. In the last year, I've thought about it a lot in terms of what would happen if Donald Trump, talking the way he does and tweeting the way he does and things, came to town meeting in my little town of 400 and started in, and people would just look at him like he'd descended from outer space, and after about 5 minutes, they'd just stop listening and say it was time for someone else to speak, and that would be that. It's only you couldn't afford to have a buffoon like Trump running things that really mattered to you day to day. No one would put him in charge of figuring out, how to plow the roads or something like that. It's only when you've reached the kind of insane scale that we operate on that he seems distant enough that you might just vote for him in order to shake things up or for entertainment value or whatever crazy set of reasons people came up with to justify voting for someone who's, manifestly not a good human being.
Well, I had kind of an interesting experience because this was back in summer 2015, and I had not heard anyone suggest Trump was a serious candidate at all. And I was just driving to Pennsylvania with my girlfriend. We were at a hotel, and I just saw Trump on the TV. And I said to her, I think Trump could actually be president. And she says, come on, people aren't that stupid. And I said, it just seems like he's on television all the time. And I just feel like anyone who's on television this much could be president.
That was a very smart observation. Yes, and I wish more people had taken it more seriously. I do take a little solace in the fact that the most popular politician in America, and by a large margin, is our junior senator in Vermont, Mr. Sanders. And I think it's a reminder that, in a certain sense, Trump is a fluke. And I guess the question will be whether the antibodies in our democratic system are strong enough to fight off a virus like this or not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's certainly seeming at this point that it's not going well for Trump, and that, I mean, but what worries me is that people are saying that this has proven to be sort of a template for a future Trump-like president who doesn't have all of his limitations and foibles and so on.
Yes, that's probably, there's a lot of things to worry about, and of course, he's doing extraordinary damage in the time that he's there. Most of all, since this is the place where I spend most of my time thinking, most of all, he's doing extraordinary damage in the environment and to the set of rules and ideas that have been set up patiently over 40 years to somehow try and protect that environment. It's a full-on disaster.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of the environment, I wanted to ask you if say I or people that are listening have family members who kind of get all their news from Fox News and are global warming deniers. Have you found any conversational tacks that are effective to use?
Well, there's a few. Depends on, you have to kind of figure out where people, what they put faith in. I mean, if they have some faith in the military as an institution, then the fact that the Pentagon is deeply concerned about climate change, has been for years, and often describes it as the greatest threat to stability that we face, sometimes impresses people. If people are serious Christians, then there's a very large body of emerging religious understanding about the need to protect the planet and protect the most vulnerable people in it. It doesn't move the, Pat Robertsons and whatever of the world, but certainly among younger evangelicals and things, there's been a great deal of movement in the right direction. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the last 20 or 30% of the people in this country who are climate deniers. I think if you spent the last 30 years just soaking your brain in Rush Limbaugh, the idea that you might really come around to reality is a fairly unlikely proposition. And so I eventually I don't think it's worth ruining Thanksgiving. I think you just say to your crazy uncle, well, I hope you're right. And if you can't restrain yourself, sometimes I'll add, you may not believe in global warming, but global warming believes in you. And that, I think, is probably the only thing that in the end is going to do it. Mother Nature is a devoted educator, and she is doing her damnedest to demonstrate exactly what's going on. I mean, if you look at the 2% of the planet that's covered by the U.S., in the last 6 months, we've seen the largest rainstorm in history, 54 inches with Hurricane Harvey, the largest, highest wind speeds over a prolonged period ever recorded on the planet with Irma, the unbelievable catastrophe that comes when a Category 5 hurricane, Maria, crashes into the absolute dead center of human habitation, Puerto Rico. We've watched California have the largest wildfire in its history occurring in December, 2 months after the end of what should have been traditional wildfire season, immediately followed by epic rains that produced mudslides that looked like pictures from Peru or Ecuador or someplace. I mean, Mother Nature is doing her level best to help us figure out what's going on.
So a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed this guy, Joe Quirk. He's the head of the Seasteading Institute, and they have all these ideas about building man-made cities to float on the ocean, and which he claims could have all sorts of environmentally reparative effects. Have you heard about this at all?
I don't know much about that, I got to say.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I thought was interesting is that he's a libertarian, and his the institute is funded substantially by Peter Thiel, who's a big libertarian. But
Yep.
they're totally accepting of climate change because they see it as a way to make money and an avenue to do all sorts of political experiments with cities floating on the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, that strikes me as, in many ways, it's a kind of libertarian approach to the world that's gotten us into the particular mess with climate change that we're in. If there was ever a problem that called for real social solidarity and people working together, not to build floating cities, but to do everything we can to prevent the rise of the sea so it doesn't drown the cities we've now got, this would be it seems to me.
Well, I agree with that entirely. I mean, I'm a liberal myself, but I thought what was interesting was that having conceptualized global warming as a problem which could lead to less government, that libertarians will accept it completely. Whereas if they conceptualize it as a problem that's going to lead to more government, they reject the science. And I just thought that was maybe an interesting.
That is true. One of the ironies, of course, of all this is that if we'd started 30 years ago, we could have dealt with climate change in ways that were extremely market-based and non-invasive. 30 years ago, a modest price on carbon would have been enough to put us on a very, very different trajectory than we ended up on. We've reached the point now where that really doesn't do the trick anymore. But and now it is going to require more dramatic government intervention. But that's what happens when you don't take a clue from what scientists are telling you.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of scientists, another person I interviewed recently is this young woman, Jess Phoenix. She's running for Congress in California, and she's a volcano scientist. And
I've been hearing about her.
Oh yeah, she has endorsements from a bunch of Star Trek actors, which is kind of how I heard about her. But I'm kind of curious, just what do you think about the scientists running for Congress? Are you 100%
I think it's great. I think, as a general rule, contact with reality is a very useful thing, and one that our political class, has studiously avoided. And so contact with any kind of reality is terrific. And science is one of the most real realities there is. So I loved watching the science march on Washington, and I've long worked with great scientists and urging them into political action. Sometimes that means going to jail, and sometimes that means going to Congress.
Yeah. I was also just kind of curious, are you since I'm a big science fiction person, if you are familiar with the cli-fi subgenre? It's like sci-fi except climate.
Oh, indeed. There's an increasing amount of wonderful stuff. Some of it really transcendent. I think, for my money, the best science fiction, and in many ways the best fiction of the last year, was Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140, which I don't know if you've read, but is a just remarkable imagining of New York once the sea level has risen 100 years hence. As one would expect from his, given his history, it's just a terrific book. I think it's probably the best thing he's ever written, and a wonderful and oddly cheerful book, I must say. I really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I haven't read that one. I interviewed Kim Stanley Robinson a couple of years ago about one of his earlier books, and I don't really have time to read books unless it's for an interview these days. But that one looked really, really fascinating. So
it's great, and sort of like his Green Mars, Red Mars, Blue Mars trilogy. It's really more. It's science fiction, but more political science than science. I mean, it's really interested in how people will figure out how to govern themselves and work together and things in extreme circumstances, or so it seems to me from those books.
Yeah. Are you familiar with other cli-fi writers like Paolo Bacigalupi or Tobias Buckell or anyone else like that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think, some of it tends to be, tends to fall into genre traps of, dystopian, sort of dystopian cliches, and some of it's really, really good. I wrote a piece maybe 15 years ago arguing that there had been very limited artistic response to climate change, which was odd given the scale and magnitude. And I'm very glad to see that changing on every front. And fiction is certainly a good example of how that's happening now.
Yeah, my girlfriend just emailed me a link. I didn't have a chance to look at it before I started talking to you, but the headline was something like the new hot genre is solar punk, where it's, instead of cyberpunk, but focusing on how solar technology, civilization's built on solar technology and could be a lot cleaner and better and so on. So that was pretty interesting.
There you go. Straight from steampunk to solar punk.
Yeah. So I was also just reading your book Enough, which deals with a lot of the technologies that the sort of science fiction technologies we talk about on the show, although from a pretty skeptical perspective.
Yes.
Yep. Have you changed your minds about anything in the book since you wrote it?
I'm writing a long book now that in part covers some of that same territory. And I continue to be very unimpressed by the idea that we need to enhance human beings and make us better than we are and so on and so forth. I think most of it is underthought and juvenile in the extreme. And when I read, people like Peter Thiel or people rattling on about how humans shouldn't have to die and investing zillions of dollars to figure out how he's going to be immortal and so on. Mostly it just sends a shudder through me, I must say.
Yeah. Well, so just for listeners, so the technologies that you talk about in the book are germline engineering of humans, nanotechnology, and advanced robotics.
Yes, it's sort of germline engineering is the one that's sort of closest to reality, although I think at this point, the sort of other complex of things that you might usefully group under the sort of AI rubric are now reaching a kind of point of maturity where we can see both their promises and maybe more prominently their dangers too. And I think those dangers are less. I worry less about the various scenarios that people have constructed where they go wrong and consume the entire world in the effort to make more paper clips or something, and more about just what happens if they go right, and and we kind of end the human experiment and replace it with a bunch of all-knowing mainframes someplace.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so what, actually, could you just talk about what was the process of writing that book like? I guess because you went around to a bunch of conferences, it sounded like, or talked to a bunch of futurists?
Yeah, I'm a reporter by background, so I I read widely and then talked to tons of the people involved in all of this stuff, and I continue to, and some of them I really like and enjoy. I really enjoy talking to Ray Kurzweil, though I disagree with him profoundly about all manner of things. I find it, I find that I get a good, it just always makes my brain feel more interesting when we've sat down to talk for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of those, the ideas like that we're going to achieve immortality in my lifetime or something to be extraordinarily unlikely. And actually, even just a bunch of the, since this book was published in 2003, you can kind of look at how some of these predictions played out, and a lot of them did not work out that well.
Some of them, I'm afraid, are much closer than we would have thought. The advent of CRISPR technology to work on our genes, it finally is the kind of word processor that biologists have been looking for a long time. And I think developments actually are coming at extraordinary speed there, and of course far faster than the process of thinking about whether they're a good idea or not.
Well, but just to take a couple of examples from the book, you had someone who was predicting germline engineering of humans to eliminate obesity by 2010, complete artificial wombs within a few years.
Oh yeah, now, some of these guys are just nuts and just are forever, like, oh yes, by such a date will, and that's one of the things I point out in the book. There's an immense amount of nonsense too that goes on in this world. But, at this point, there's serious money coming from serious people. I mean, the guys who are doing the experimentation on bankrolling the work on, say, immortality are, they're not bit players. They're the Sergey Brins and Peter Thiels of the world,
Yeah. Well, so what, if people agreed that we wanted to put the brakes on some of these technologies, what sort of measures would you propose to do that?
Well, that's a good question, and it's one of the reasons I'm so interested in resistance in general, because I think that we actually do have the power sometimes when we take it to stand up to things and force systems to accommodate. So, for instance, we've actually done a reasonably good job of, though at the moment it's a little scary, of reining in the idea of dropping nuclear weapons on people. The U.S. did it twice, and so far everybody's been able to persuade everybody else never to do it again. Word does not seem to have reached the Oval Office at the moment that's a priority, but one hopes that cooler heads will prevail even there. That's a good example of a place where we've actually backed off pretty powerfully and set up a set of international regimes to make it much, much more difficult to do stupid things.
I mean, sort of the problem I have with that analogy is that nuclear weapons are really hard to make, and the number of people who want them very badly is relatively small, whereas
That's
the
true.
number of people who want extremely smart, healthy kids is a very large number of people.
That's true. It's also true that with nuclear weapons, having one or two of them go off the wrong place is a very huge deal. Having a few eccentrics figure out how they're going to engineer a kid or something may not be may not break the dam once and for all. And there's plenty of ways to try and rein in errant industries like that. I mean, the profit motive would be extraordinarily important, and that's one that you can regulate. If you can't get insurance or so on, then it makes it much harder to do this kind of work. So it's not the center of my thought. I'm sort of more interested in the philosophical questions, but I think that the notion of inevitability is usually a kind of smokescreen designed to prevent having to do any further hard thinking about things.
I mean, because a couple of years ago, I interviewed this guy, Gregory Pence. You reference him in your book. He's a proponent of human cloning. And he was saying that there is much less resistance to these ideas in Asia. And he was putting forward the idea that if we, put the brakes on this, that we're just going to fall behind in this area.
Yeah, well, who knows? As I recall, he's also the guy who's eager to engineer people so that, as he put it, they have these sunny dispositions of golden retrievers. I think I'll wait for further verification on this.
I mean, so what do you where do you see human civilization going in kind of like a century or two? Do you think that?
Well, I think it's entirely possible that it will go to hell, or at least a place of a similar temperature. We're, causing extraordinary problems with what we're doing to the climate system. There's never been anything like and even close to that. And, at this point, we're busily melting the biggest physical features on Earth, the North and South Pole. We're, changing the chemistry of the oceans at a pace that's never been done before, so on and so forth. So if we're unable to rein ourselves in, then we're in big trouble in that sense. The good news is we're capable of reining ourselves in. The engineers have done a very good job over the last decade. The price of a solar panel has fallen so fast that it's now the cheapest way to produce electrons in most of the world. And that means we could get an extraordinary amount done. We're not doing it very fast, mostly because our political system is so clogged with the money and power of the fossil fuel industry that refuses to relinquish its business model. But that's why we set up big movements and do what we can. So who knows exactly how that will come out. If it comes out okay, then it strikes me that it's possible that we will continue to move in the direction of a more decentralized, more local, more linked up, and more interesting world. And that's the best case that one can make, it seems to me. So I'm willing to make it from time to time.
Well, yes. So, I mean, if we somehow manage to make it okay through the climate change situation, I guess I'm asking, where do you think things go from there? Because, I mean, if you read Kim Stanley Robinson's 2312 or something, there's a lot of ideas that will spread to, the moon and the other planets in the solar system.
Yeah, the space stuff always strikes me as, it may just be temperament, but I don't get it. I mean, the least hospitable place you can find on planet Earth, even in the sort of worst climate change scenarios, is still 100 times more hospitable than any place you can find any place else out there in the solar system. So I know that Jeff Bezos badly wants to drive something off to Mars, but the whole thing seems nuts to me. And I think it's always going to be a minor part of things. I don't think we're ever going to lift many people off the surface of the planet. And I think I think the great dramas really are not out in space. They're here close to home as we try to figure out how to take care of the one extraordinarily beautiful, fertile, forgiving place that we know about in the universe.
Well, right, I think the point that Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk make often is that the Earth has a limited lifespan, right? Sooner or later, the sun's going to, in the very long term, the sun's going to explode. Or in the shorter term, there's asteroids and gamma ray bursts and stuff. And that if all our eggs are in one basket, so to speak, we could be in big trouble.
This just demonstrates my limited imagination. I can't get myself worked up over the fact that a billion years from now the sun is going to expand to the size where Earth is going to be in trouble. We've had a 10,000-year run so far as a civilization. Seems to me that if you and I can figure out how to get us through another couple of thousand years, that'll be a good thing to pass on to whoever comes next and let them worry about that.
Mm-hmm. So the new book you're working on, what kind of who are you talking to, or what does it say?
Next year will be the 30th anniversary of this book, The End of Nature. That was the first book about climate change. So this is not a rewriting of that, although the first chapter will have a lot about what we now know about climate and what in fact did happen and why. But it'll go on to talk about these other technologies and to talk about some of the things that have kept us from dealing with the problems that we have and how we might be able to get around those. I hope that I manage to figure out how to end it on a relatively hopeful note, although no guarantees because I haven't gotten there yet.
Well, so you said that you'll talk to futurists like Ray Kurzweil. You kind of keep in touch with them. Are there any?
I just talked to Ray recently, in fact. These are all people that interest me a good deal.
Are there any science fiction writers that you're kind of keeping in touch with?
I don't tend not to talk to that many other writers, but I sure read what they're putting out there. And I've always thought that science fiction, I've thought for the last 20 years that science fiction was really the only realm where people were dealing intelligently with some of these questions about things like AI and so on. And I think that the reason is because they were the only people who were having to perform the thought experiment of putting the power of these technologies, potential power of them, up against the scale of human beings, of their characters. and just figuring out that human beings and human characters quickly got overwhelmed by technology at this scale. And that explains, I think, a great deal of the largely dark tone that science fiction has carried in recent years. It's carried the sort of burden for the larger society that hasn't been thinking through these things in a serious way.
Because in this book, you mention authors like Greg Egan and Vernor Vinge, who are not household names, who are only really known among science fiction readers. So I was kind of impressed that you've delved into it that deeply.
Yeah, well.
Have you read Ian M. Banks, the Scottish writer?
No, I haven't. Should I?
I love him, yeah, but he has a series called the Culture Series, and it's a sort of utopian civilization that incorporates, AIs pretty much run the government, and the people are all genetically engineered to, they have glands that manufacture recreational drugs whenever they want, and it really, if you want a non-dystopian vision of those sorts of technologies, I think.
Banks, Banks.
Yep, yeah. Ian, it's IAIN, middle initial M, BANKS.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, because it was interesting for me reading your book enough because you talk a lot about like people's gut revulsion and instinctual allergy to germline engineering, and just because I grew up reading all the science fiction, I don't have that sort of gut revulsion. I mean, I feel like I'm cognizant of the dangers, the kind of dangers you talk about, that the technology will go wrong and the gray goo and all that kind of stuff. But I guess I feel like I don't have any instinctive opposition to the idea.
That might be, maybe too, that it'd be good to read some things other than science fiction too, to remind us, what is extremely special about human beings as we know them now. That's one of the things I've never really understood. It seems to me there's a deep and ironic contradiction in the world, in the minds of a great many futurists and things who, on the one hand, think human beings are so incredibly special that they must never die and need to be, and on the other hand, think that they're, basically just neat machines that will be happily replaced by, much smarter things coming along down the road. And you often find people holding both of those thoughts at the same time, which makes me think that scientists or futurists or tech people are at least as prone to a kind of superstition as the rest of us. I've always found it amusing that the people who most loudly decry religion and exalt atheism and so on are also the people most completely unable to come to terms with the idea that we're going to die. I don't know. There's a level of inability to see what's good about the world that we inhabit now that I think gets in the way of clear-headedness sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's people joke about the quote-unquote rapture of the nerds, that a lot of these things are, they have this, as you say, these sort of religious apocalyptic overtones. But I don't know, is there any way to, it seems like not wanting to die is a pretty natural thing. I don't think you need to be crazy to want
but of course it is. Of course it is. But of course, a great deal of human culture has been devoted to coming to terms beautifully and profitably with that. The earliest stories we know about, Gilgamesh, are center on precisely that question. And we have, thousands of years worth of profound ethical development based on human beings coming to terms with that and what it means, to the point where a creature that doesn't die isn't a human in the sense that we've come to think of the term, and we should, I think, be careful before we rush into that. The vision of people desperate to put their brains in cold storage awaiting the moment when some higher being awakens them. It seems nuts to me.
Yeah. I guess another point I kind of wanted to raise is that you're sort of saying that if we put the brakes on these advanced technologies, that the world, and I think this is a very compelling argument. I actually wrote it down here. No, I don't see it. But you say basically that that the world as it exists right now is pretty good, and if we pursue these technologies, we're taking a big risk that we have absolutely no idea where they might lead. And I think that point is really well taken. But I think that what is maybe not being taken into account there is that on the trajectory we're on, we seem to be headed for disaster, right? As you were just saying, right, with the climate change and all that ecological collapse and stuff.
Example. But climate change is the perfect example of the disaster that we don't need to have. It's, with the smart build-out of smart, interesting technology, we can do all kinds of things. I mean, we now know. I mean, there's ample evidence coming out of, places near you, but, Stanford, elsewhere. Studies in the last couple of years to demonstrate that by 2030 or 2040, we could, with the existing off-the-shelf solar and battery and wind technology, we could power the whole planet just fine and escape the worst ravages of climate change. The challenges are less technological, I think, than they are political. I mean, why don't we do that? It's because of dramatic imbalances of power in our society and the, fact that people, oil and gas barons like the Koch brothers are able to dictate what goes on in our political life. Those are the interesting challenges to be met at this point. So I don't see the need for a wholesale reordering of everything about us and the world we live in. I think we're quite possible to imagine a world where we make judicious use of limited technologies to keep things to allow us to mature as societies and as individuals.
Well, no, I completely agree that the problem seems resolvable with current day technology. But as you say, the problem is that people is like human nature in a sense is what we're fighting. And I think that that's maybe the point some futurists would make, is that we evolved biologically to survive on the African savanna and to always want to acquire more stuff and never be satisfied with what we have and always need more. And that
right, but we're capable of surmounting that. I mean, we know we are because each of us know people who have. It's not easy, but that's what maturity is about. And the people we admire the most in the world are precisely the people who have stopped thinking so much about themselves and figured out how to spend a good deal of their life thinking about others. And the fact that there are plenty of people who meet that test is a good indication that it's by no means impossible. So that would be a good thing to aim for, it seems to me, and endlessly more interesting than figuring out how to engineer people with X-ray eyesight or wings or something like that. Figuring out how to keep working in a direction that the best people we know about are already headed.
Yeah. No, yeah. Okay, so there's one other thing I promise this is the last one I want to push back against, is you say we live in a world where much meaning has already eroded, where we don't have the support of, say, the medieval church. And this is sort of like the opposite of my worldview, but I think of the life of a medieval peasant as being pretty meaningless, that they're just working these drudgery jobs and in constant terror of demons and witches and hell. And I feel like my life or yours has much more meaning than if we were medieval peasants.
It's an interesting question. And there's clearly things that are much better in the world than there were in medieval times, and it's good that we've gotten them. But I think in terms of sheer meaning, it's possible that you're wrong in this case. that people were embedded in local communities and in Christendom and in lots of things that gave most people a kind of place in the world. Now, we've been liberated from many things over the last few centuries. And most of those liberations, I agree with you, in the end are brought more benefit than not. So we've been liberated from the fact that we're isolated to a particular geographic area. Now you can go way beyond your own village quite easily. And that's a liberation. It comes with costs, a kind of rootlessness and whatever, but it's real. Women have been dramatically liberated, and that's, I think, good in all respects, and other people who were oppressed in many ways. But there are ways that, that liberations, this long series of liberations can take us one step too far, I mean, I have no desire to be liberated from, say, dying, and I don't think anybody else in their right mind should either, because it would transform us in very, very deep and powerful ways. And I think when we think about that, we really begin to recognize that the liberation from our neighbors is gone further than it should have in our society. I mean, a high consumer culture meant becoming a culture in which, for the first time in human history, people had no need of anyone around them. If you have a credit card, Amazon will bring you everything you need to your door. You never have to see another human being. And that seems like a liberation. You don't have to sit with boring people ever, and no one intrudes on you. And except that's not what we're built for or what we're about. I mean, everything we know indicates that humans are happiest and most fulfilled when they're in contact with all kinds of other people all the time. And it's one of the interesting reasons why, this is something I explored years ago in a book called Deep Economy, why all the survey data and things we have show that Americans were happier with their lives, more satisfied 50 years ago than they are now, even though our material status is far higher. So I think be careful with the notion of liberation. As with everything, our current dominant metaphor, really, and it's certainly exemplified by our president, is that more of things is always better. But as you know, when you think about it, there are other kinds of questions that are threshold questions. So, I, as you can tell from reading Radio Free Vermont, very much enjoy drinking beer. One of the things that makes me happy is that Vermont has more breweries per capita than any place on earth. And I'm very clear that drinking a beer or two every night makes me feel happier than I otherwise would. I'm also very clear that drinking 6 or 8 does not, that proposition breaks down at some point. That this is a threshold question, not a linear question. And so we be wise to ask ourselves if we're getting near certain thresholds or not.
Yeah. Okay. So before we run out of time, I wanted to ask a little bit more about podcasting. You say that my daughter Sophie has recently taken her first job in podcasting. Could you talk about that?
She's working at WGBH, where she's producing the Frontline, the video documentary series. They've started a audio documentary series called Frontline Dispatch that's just terrific, and I encourage people to subscribe.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, actually, the premise of this book, because I think about that a lot. If I was ever on the run from the law, could I keep doing my podcast? And that's sort of a weird thought I have. And so you actually, I guess I'm not the only podcaster that has that thought.
Absolutely. Outlaw radio pirate radio is where we're going. And you should go and look at the history of the great pirate radio stations, which is one of the funnier, better bits of media history that there is. In fact, someone made a terrific movie not that many years ago about one of the pirate radio stations that broadcast for years on a ship off the coast of the UK. and I think that might even have been the title of the movie, if I'm remembering correctly, Pirate Radio.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. I never saw the movie, but I saw ads about it. Now that this was before I was a podcaster, so now I have more interest
now you gotta
in
go
checking
see
that out. Yeah. Do you listen to a lot of podcasts now? Like, have you sort of transitioned from radio to podcasts, or?
I listen to some of both, but yes, I have a long list of podcasts that I greatly enjoy.
Are there maybe like 3 or something that you could recommend?
No, I mean, the ones that I love most are all the obvious ones. I mean, I would no more miss a session of This American Life than I would, I miss my evening beer. I love, there's a very, very fine music podcast called Sound Opinions that I listen to pretty religiously. And I love my daughter's new podcast, Frontline Dispatch. It really is very, very special documentary reporting. I mean, done in the old-fashioned tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so everyone go check those out. So we're pretty much out of time. Bill, do you have any final thoughts or just anything else?
No, this has been such a good conversation. Thank you for having it, and thank you for the book advice. I'm always eager for more books to read. Oh yeah,
Iain M. Banks. I just love him. There's plenty more book science fiction book recommendations where that came from. But I guess you could probably just look through the list of episodes we've done. We've interviewed most of my favorite authors.
Good for you.
Yeah. And so I think we'll wrap things up there. And so we've been talking about This Book Enough by Bill McKibben, which is, it's a very interesting book. Gave me a lot to think about, challenged a lot of the ideas I hold dear. So it's definitely worth checking out. And then his first novel, Radio Free Vermont. And so, Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, brother. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Bill McKibben for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Daniel Tietzer, who just made a very generous one-time contribution to the show via PayPal. I also want to thank Serial Box for sponsoring today's show. Check out their new thriller, False Idols. And remember that you can get a discount on the first season of any Serial Box series by visiting serialbox.com and using the promo code GEEK18. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.